So you're thinking about a career where you could actually, like, influence the economy.
That's a pretty big goal.
It is, right. But that's what we're diving into today. We're going to figure out what an economic policy officer actually does day to day.
Yeah, and maybe by the end of this, we'll know if it's the right path for you. We've got this really cool guide from RoleCatcher, so
They've got, like, tons of resources on this stuff.
it's crazy how much info they have. But one of the things that really struck me was
And this is what's so cool about this career path.
the sheer impact these folks have. Like, it's not just about, understanding economic theory.
Right, it's not just textbook stuff.
It's about seeing how all these different pieces fit together.
Hmm.
Competitiveness, innovation, global trade, they all play a role.
It's like they're solving this giant puzzle.
That's a great way to put it.
Yep.
Economic detectives, that's what they are. Analyzing trends, figuring out why things are happening, and this is the big one, they have to come up with solutions.
Talk about pressure. Okay, economic detectives, I'm into it. But where are these detectives doing their work?
Good question. I mean, you probably picture, like, some dimly lit government office, stacks of files, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And while it's true that a lot of economic policy officers do work in government agencies, it's not the only option. Actually, it's way more diverse than you might think. We're talking consulting firms, nonprofits, even remote work is becoming more common.
So there's some flexibility there, which is
Yeah.
always good to know. But I'm also seeing here in the RoleCatcher guide that long working hours is a potential downside. So maybe not so flexible when it comes to your schedule.
That's the trade-off, right? High stakes, high reward. It takes a special kind of dedication to thrive in this field. Late nights, number crunching, all that fun stuff.
Yeah, you've got to be pretty passionate to be excited about those late night number crunching sessions. And speaking of crunching numbers, the guide really emphasizes those analytical skills, which makes sense given what we've talked about. But what does that look like day to day?
So imagine this. You're digging into economic data, right? You're looking for patterns, trying to connect the dots, and then you're using those insights to build models, kind of like you might have done back in Econ 101.
Oh, Econ 101, those were the days.
Except now, instead of just trying to pass a test, you're analyzing trends that could impact, like, entire nations.
It's Econ 101 with real-world consequences.
That's it. And that actually brings us to another important point. It's not enough to just be good with numbers. You also have to be able to explain what those numbers mean.
You have to tell the story behind the data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where communication and persuasion come in.
And that's interesting because the guide specifically mentions native language as a key skill. I'll admit, that one threw me off a bit. Why is that so important for, essentially an economics role?
Well, because it doesn't matter how brilliant your analysis is if you can't explain it to anyone.
Right. Makes sense.
You've got to be able to communicate those findings, and not just to other economists. Think government officials, business leaders, even the general public.
So we're talking reports, presentations.
All of that. And in today's world, let's be real, a well-crafted tweet can go a long way. You've got to be able to connect with people where they are.
And we can't forget about social media. That's everywhere these days.
It's unavoidable, but it's also a powerful tool.
It really is. It's all algorithms and data analysis. It's kind of like economics has gone digital.
In a way, it has, and that's something that today's economic policy officers have to be aware of.
So what does that actually look like? Are they, like, glued to Twitter all day?
Not quite, but they do need to be comfortable with technology. I mean, forget those old school spreadsheets. We're talking sophisticated software now, social media analytics, even things like AI are starting to pop up.
Okay, hold on. AI, that's a whole other deep dive.
We could talk about that for hours.
We might have to. But for now, let's say someone's listening to this and they're thinking, this is it, this is the career for me. What do they actually do? How do they break into this world?
Well, the RoleCatcher guide really stresses the importance of internships. It's all about getting that real-world experience.
Makes sense. But how do you even get your foot in the door? Those internships are super competitive.
It takes some hustle, that's for sure. Think government agencies, think tanks, research organizations. Those are the kinds of places that offer these internships.
So, like, start reaching out.
Exactly. And network. Go to conferences, use LinkedIn, connect with people in the field.
Because it's not just what you know.
It's who you know, too.
Exactly. Now, the guide also talks about the career progression for an economic policy officer, which I thought was really interesting. They basically lay out what that journey often looks like.
Yeah, and they break it down into 4 stages: entry level, junior, mid-level, and senior. And of course, each level comes with more responsibility.
So you're starting out maybe assisting with research, and eventually you could be leading those big policy initiatives.
That's the idea. You work your way up, gain experience, and hopefully make a real impact along the way.
I like how RoleCatcher uses real examples of professionals at each stage, too. It makes it feel more tangible.
Right. It's one thing to read a job description. It's another to see how someone actually built their career in that role.
Totally. And speaking of helpful info, the guide also has this great FAQ section.
Oh, yeah, those FAQs are super useful. They really cover a lot of ground.
Like, they answer those questions you might not even think to ask.
Exactly. Like, what does an economic policy officer actually do all day?
They say it's to develop economic strategies and monitor aspects of economics, such as competitiveness, innovation, and trade.
Which, as we've been discussing, is a pretty big deal.
No kidding. And of course, they have the qualification question.
And the answer is always more education.
Well, it does help. They say a degree in economics, public policy, or a related field is key.
A bachelor's might get you in the door, but for those higher level positions, they're really looking for master's degrees or even PhDs.
So if you're thinking about a career change, that might be your sign to go back to school.
It's never too late. They also talked about the importance of staying up to date on things like competitiveness, innovation, and trade.
Makes sense. You got to know what's happening in the world.
Exactly. Economic policy officers have to have their finger on the pulse of global trends, looking for opportunities and anticipating problems.
It's like they have to be 10 steps ahead of everyone else, right?
Totally. And that actually reminds me of another one of the FAQs about how economic policy officers actually contribute to policy development.
Which, let's be real, is kind of the whole point.
Right. It all goes back to that research and analysis we were talking about.
So they're using data to identify problems, find solutions.
And then, really importantly, they have to sell those solutions.
Because they're not the ones writing the policies.
Exactly. They're the ones influencing the people who do.
The economic masterminds behind the scenes.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Oh, and speaking of FAQs, there's one about economic projects and programs.
I was just going to ask about that. What's their role there?
They're often involved in pretty much every stage, from that initial brainstorming session to the actual rollout.
Which makes sense, given how much they understand about, how the economy works.
Exactly. They're like economic consultants, in a way.
Okay, last FAQ I wanted to hit. How do they even start to figure out these public policy problems?
Well, they have to do a lot of digging. Figure out the root causes, whether it's global trends, domestic issues, unintended consequences.
It's like detective work, for real.
It is, and it's not always straightforward, but that's also what makes it so rewarding when they can actually make a difference.
Okay, before we wrap things up, I wanted to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the different career paths.
Oh, right. Because it's not just about working in the government, although that is a big one.
You said there are opportunities with international organizations, research institutions.
Consulting firms, advocacy groups.
Right, there are tons of options if you have the skills.
Which I think is really exciting.
It is. So for someone listening who's now totally hooked on this whole economic policy officer thing, what should they be thinking about?
Well, first and foremost, do you even like economics?
Because this isn't a job you go into for the money.
Definitely not. You have to be passionate about it because it's a lot of work.
And you have to be comfortable with data, analysis, problem solving.
Oh, and communication. Can't forget that.
So important.
Yeah.
And be prepared to keep learning.
Because things are always changing in this field.
Which I guess is true for most careers these days, but especially this one.
Definitely. And if you want to dive even deeper, RoleCatcher actually has some amazing resources on their website.
They do. Everything from interview tips to salary info.
They even have a tool that helps you tailor your resume.
That's so cool. Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
If you're passionate about economics and you want a career where you can really make a difference, this might be it.
It's challenging, for sure, but also incredibly rewarding.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of economic policy officers. Until next time.